Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to a very special episode of Candid with RMT. And today I have with me one of my mentors, Dr. Arghya Sengupta. Sir, welcome to Candid with RMT.
Thanks, Raghu. Good to see you.
Likewise, sir. Likewise. Being a gold medalist from NLS, sir, and then subsequently bagging the prestigious Oxford Rhodes Scholarship, sir. How do you recall, sir, long back being a law student now?
Well, now it's so long ago that I don't recall it very much. But as far as being a law student is concerned, it was the most exhilarating time of my life. Till then, we were all part of India's famous or infamous school education system, which was essentially about mugging up and putting it out at the exam. Whereas law school was the first time that we had to think for ourselves in terms of the larger normative questions of what kind of life do we want to lead as Indians, what kind of country do we want to call home, what kind of justice system do our citizens deserve. And law school was exhilarating because it was asking all these difficult questions. On a more practical note, it was the first time that I was away from home in a hostel in Bengaluru. I had grown up in Calcutta and hostel. I'd gone to National Law School in Bengaluru. So it was great living alone with a group of friends, fending for ourselves for the very first time. And there was as much learning inside the classroom as there was outside. So it was a great experience overall.
And so then subsequently moving on to Oxford, any cultural shift, how was the experience there?
I think, as I say, giving an analogy, that the first case that we were taught in law school, and any Indian law student will have this example, is, if you remember, a case in the law of tort called Donahue versus Stevenson.
Yes.
We all remember this case where a woman found a dead snail in a bottle of ginger beer. That became the most landmark case in the law of negligence, which is now taught 150 years later, halfway around the world, as the first case that anyone studies in the college in law school. When I went, the reason I'm giving this slight digression is that when I went to Oxford, I realized why Donahue versus Stevenson was such a big case. It was a big case because Donahue versus Stevenson happened in England, and the culture of law in England is a culture from which this case spawned. So if this were to happen in India, for example, this happens all the time. What would have happened? The lady would have taken the snail out of the ginger beer bottle and drunk the rest of it. It would not have been a case at all. And this happens to us all the time in food as well as other items. So what I realized in Oxford is that Oxford has a great education system and a legal culture that is suited for that country. We have got a transplant of that and tried to adapt it for our circumstances. But I believe that we need to ask the more fundamental questions in terms of what kind of legal education do Indian law students need, what kind of lawyering does Indian society need, and what kind of judging does the Indian polity need. And I think these are questions we must ask ourselves.
Tell us, let's dive more deep into this, just graduating from Oxford and coming back to India. Where did the idea of Vidhi stem from, sir?
Well, the idea of Vidhi stemmed from my time at Oxford. When we were there, I was a PhD student and there was lots of frenetic activity in India. I always had one eye on what was happening in India, and at that point of time, there was a lot of discussion around the nuclear liability bill, which was becoming law of the land after the Indo-US nuclear deal. With a few friends, we had submitted an unsolicited report to the Standing Committee of Parliament with many suggestions on improvements. They called us as a 26-year-old student. It was a really heady feeling to be called to the Indian Parliament to make a presentation. It was sometime in 2010. And we made that presentation, and the next thing I knew, I was being asked to draft a few sections of the law. So imagine you're a 25, 26-year-old, you're one moment you sent in an unsolicited report, the next moment you're drafting the law of the land. We did that for about 6 or 7 more assignments, and we realized that there is a gap here in the system, that lawyers don't engage in the lawmaking process. As lawyers, we all wait for disputes to arise and then we go to court.
Absolutely.
But we don't engage in the lawmaking process. So the idea of Vidhi stemmed from that realization that there is a role that lawyers with particular areas of domain expertise can play at the stage of lawmaking. And when I came back from Oxford to India, I started Vidhi together with my founding team, and the rest is history.
Well said, sir. Well said. Working, forming, and just the idea of Vidhi. I'm sure there must have been obstacles along your journey, sir. How did you overcome them? Initial interactions with the government, the officials, the secretaries. How was that? And what are some of the prominent policy changes that Vidhi was able to successfully bring out in their initial years?
So I think there were three major obstacles right at the outset. The first obstacle was age. We were all young. We were all lawyers in our 20s. And we had landed up in Delhi and we were now telling the government that, we are competent lawyers from the best universities in the world and we are here to help you. Now give us a chance to do that. And many people said, ये तो बच्चे हैं, ये क्या करेंगे? ये हमें क्या समझाएंगे? And they were true. This was a legitimate criticism. We had no experience of the way in which the system functioned. So it was only over a period of time that they realized that one, we are not threatening their jobs. We are only trying to help them do their jobs better. And secondly, we may be young, but we have considerable experience of dealing with legal systems around the world, which could be brought to bear for India's benefit. So I think that was the first challenge. The second challenge, of course, was sustainability. How do you run an institution? At the end of the day, you may have a good idea, but many good ideas go to die because you don't know how to run the institution. And the second key thing was how are we going to get funding for this? And I'm grateful that we had a set of philanthropic funders who came forward right at the outset, said that they believed in our mission and good governance will only happen through good laws, and they supported us till the time we actually got government projects. And the third was complete non-partisanship. It's important for us to remain independent. We are researchers, we are lawyers. We provide our independent advice, and at the end of the day, it's for governments, the change agents, whoever we are working with, to whether they take that advice or they leave it. So it's very critical for us to have to retain our independence at all points of time. So these were three challenges that were there right at the beginning, and these continue to remain things that we have to face, although I must say that they have reduced somewhat in their intensity. To the second part of your question, there were many projects that we worked on, and we just completed 10 years, so we just looked at the data. So we've done 396 laws, rules and regulations for the government of India and state governments in the last 10 years, so that's an average of about 40 per year. Some of the notable ones have included the first draft of the Personal Data Protection Bill, which has now become the DPDP Act, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, which has been done by my colleague Devanshu Mukherjee and his team, continue to work with the IBBI on that. We've done some seminal litigation in court on end-of-life care, the legality of advanced directives, which was done by my founding team member and colleague Hari Mehta, on tribunals by Alok Prasanna, and also a landmark judgment with the Center for Legal Policy versus Union of India to end discrimination against persons affected by leprosy. So these are the highlights that come to mind. There are many, many more, and it has overall been a very satisfying journey.
Right, so kudos on completing a decade, sir. I remember my time at Vidhi when I was just an intern, but the whole atmosphere that was there at the office sort of got that whole feeling of you working almost alongside the government, because every policy or every research that you sort of took upon, you sort of made it a point that okay, this is going to go up to the government, so let's make sure that we give our 100%.
And I think it's been very gratifying to see your journey as well, Raghu. I remember you came in as an intern who was half the size that you are currently at that point of time, and there was always a spark in turn, there's always an ambition. I think you were also doing something with Sham Diwan around that time, and I could always see the ambition that was there in you and several other interns like yourself who had come. And I think in the last 10 years, if there's been one part that has been most gratifying about this journey, it's really been able to attract talent like yourself to come to Vidhi, to be able to work first as interns, then as research fellows, and to be able to see that talent grow, because it's a unique. I believe and I continue to hope that we've created a unique kind of institution where we do independent research, but at the same time, as you said, research that is driven for impact, to make sure that if this becomes law of the land tomorrow, it shouldn't be something that isn't right for the citizens of India. So I think that's the constant effort that we have to make.
Right, so since you mentioned about Mr. Shyam Devan, sir, how was the right to privacy
So that's where Shyam and I were on opposite
yes,
sides.
I know, sir. That
both
must
in
have
the
been a
both in the PAN Aadhaar matter as well as
Yes,
the
sir.
right to privacy matter. Though the Puttaswamy case had become an academic kind of case at that time. Academic not because it was not important, but academic because we were discussing this question as to whether there is a right to privacy in the constitution. And I felt that both the petitioners and the respondents were largely saying, or most of the respondents were largely saying the same thing. But arguing in court was it's every law student's dream to argue in the Supreme Court and to argue before a constitution bench of 9 judges was of course a thrilling experience. And I would say that looking back at that time, one was it was thrilling for two reasons. One is of course being able to argue side by side with legal stalwarts. You mentioned Mr. Diwan, but there were several others. The who's who were there.
Yes.
Of the bar were there in that case. So it was one to share space with them was of course a thrilling experience, and also because of the fact that you realize where the court can actually make an impact and where it can't, and it led me to the belief that the court can do a lot of good in matters which are disputes between parties. So, for example, in the PAN Aadhaar linking case, where the PAN should be linked with Aadhaar, where some taxpayers have gone and together with Binoy Viswam, who was a member of the CPI, member of parliament, who had gone to court challenging the PAN Aadhaar linkage. I think that was a classic dispute before the court, where the court, by its judgment, where it said that PAN Aadhaar linking is constitutional, could bring quietus to the issue. But there are several other issues, particularly in relation to larger social welfare questions. Should Aadhaar be used for direct benefit transfers? What are the potential problems for in that usage? And that only confirmed my view that the ultimate change agent in any system of governance is the elected government. Is not the courts of law. As lawyers, we sometimes tend to get carried away, particularly with public interest litigation, that the court will drive change. And yes, in certain situations it can. But that experience in court, not just in this case, but several others as well, proved to me that the court has its powers, but also has its limitations.
Right, so I mean, I couldn't agree more, sir, on this aspect. Moving on, sir, and talking about public law, that is something that is very close to you, sir. And I remember I was in the public law team at my time at Vidhi. How has public law evolved over the years with different governments and different judgments of the court?
Yeah, I think that public law itself is a very wide category.
Absolutely.
One area in which I've seen a lot of growth over the course of the last decade is in relation to regulatory law and theory. So there's obviously been many regulators that have come up over the course of the last decade. We ourselves have worked on many, whether it is the IBBI, which works on bankruptcy, or RERA, which works on real estate, or even NAFRA, which is on regulating chartered accountants. There are a whole range of regulators that have come up, and I see a lot of theoretical work that's been done in terms of shaping what an appropriate regulatory structure looks like. Where do you want to regulate, and where do you want to take a step back and enable the free market to operate? And that ultimately really comes down to a question of where do you think consumer interest would be furthered by regulation, and where do you think it would be furthered by a hands-on approach. So I think work in public law, as it has significantly improved and has significantly grown in that direction. So there are many other areas, but I think public law continues to remain a backbone of
Absolutely, sir. Absolutely. So, how has policy and governance as subjects been undertaken by the government, and how has the bureaucracy sort of responded in terms of implementing or taking that advisory support from notable think tanks such as Vidhi?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to realize is that the government is not a monolith. I think from the outside, particularly as middle class Indians, we tend to have these blanket generalizations of government, right? That we draw this what we think is ye sab bure kaam nahi karte. This is the kind of overall sense that we have. And it's not true. It's absolutely not true. And as far as the bureaucracy is concerned, I feel actually that the bureaucracy is the biggest driver for change or the biggest obstacle to change that exists. It depends on the kind of officer you have. We have been very fortunate to deal with officers who have been mostly enlightened and want to make change happen. They are some of the hardest working people in the country, working 7 days a week without any set hours to make change happen. And I think that really sort of busts this middle class notion that you kuch kaam nahi karte and sort of are generally not working in the public interest. And I think over the course of the last 10 years, I've also seen a general willingness to take on assistance from outside. Now that could be Vidhi, that could be somebody else, but I think over a period of time, bureaucrats have realized that the world of law and policy making has become extremely complicated, requires a lot of domain expertise, they neither have the time nor the expertise to do it, and they are willing to look outside for that help. And whereas right at the beginning, when we started in 2013, maybe that number would have been small, maybe 2 or 3 out of 10. Over the course of the last 10 years, I feel that the number has gone to about 7 or 8 out of 10, where bureaucrats are actually keen on engaging, on listening, on responding, and ultimately implementing.
That's quite remarkable. So, I mean, true change without the expertise in a particular domain is very difficult. And when you have those domain expertise in that area and you know that you are the decision making authority, it gets a little easier. So, in that way, you're absolutely right, sir. That change is sort of necessary. You have always been a strong supporter of the fundamental constitutional ethos. Over the years, how has the framework of the constitution developed or evolved?
This is a very large question. I would say that the framework of the constitution and its ethos is still developing. It is a work in progress. They say India is only 75 years old as a constitutional republic. When the United States was 75, it was fighting a civil war. Right? So we are still young as a nation, and there is a long way to go. I recently written a book on the subject called The Colonial Constitution, published by Juggernaut last year, and then I have argued that every generation needs to think for itself in terms of what constitutional ideals it needs. So several facets of the Constitution of India, I think, are worth embracing, and that is communal equality, non-discrimination, the right to freedom, the freedom of speech, expression, religion, and so on. I think these are aspects of the Constitution that require embracing. Equally, there are other aspects of the Constitution, like this overall police state that we live in, this Mai Baap Sarkar that it has created, preventive detention, not enough focus on duties. I think these are aspects of the Constitution that require further rethinking and research, particularly by the legal academy. So I think it's our job as lawyers to nourish and replenish the Constitution, to ensure that it provides the fundamental framework of the nation. And I think we must do a much better job in taking the Constitution to the people. Unfortunately, the Constitution is still if you go out into the public and ask, people will mostly say that ये तो वकीलों की document है. People don't have this engagement with the Constitution. Maybe they'll know 1 or 2 things in the preamble, but other than that, people don't understand the Constitution. We need to write the Constitution in simple language. We need to ensure that it is available in all Indian languages. We need to ensure that people understand their rights and obligations and duties in the Constitution. We have to do a much greater job in taking the Constitution to the people. So I think the spreading of the constitutional ethos is very much a work in progress, and all of us have a role to play in that.
Right. So, moving on to a typical day at the Vidhi office. So, I mean, I remember back in the day, there used to be events, and someday we would be having a podcast. The other day there would be some conference, of a delegation coming in from, let's say, Oxford or Harvard. The next day would be a Vidhi dialogue happening at the Indian International Center, where there'll be a panel of chief guests, and that was, I think, my first interaction with you, sir, where I sort of bumped into you and I, expressed my, want to get more into the area of policy and just learn more about it. So, how is a typical day? What is a typical day in Vidhi, like, sir?
I think a typical day is really shaped by the person at Vidhi themselves. Because we like to believe that we are a young organization that essentially privileges everyone's freedom and autonomy. It is not in that sense a traditional workspace from as you described.
Yes.
There is a lot of activity, there is a lot of excitement typically at every, may not be on an everyday basis, but on most days. And most importantly, the average age of Vidhi is 27. So as you can see, it's a young organization where people are essentially coming in, doing their work, which is hard original research. But as you said, we try and do a lot of events evidently, because we feel that events open minds to different perspectives that you may not have otherwise. And especially after COVID, where we lost 2 years, where people did work online, which does have its positives. But the biggest negative was that you didn't interact with people, and it was only interaction with people that new ideas come, that new thoughts emerge. So, and Vidhi, as you mentioned, as we continue to have events, there is a series called the Vidhi Book Adda,
Yes, sir.
which we do, which is on new books that we have. The one thing that we did right at the outset was the Great Cases series, where senior advocates would come in and talk about cases that they were a part of and then they had argued. So Raju Ramchandran had come to talk about Azmal Kasab, Gopal Subramanian was talking about the 2G auction case. We had several other lawyers who had come in at that time. We've just restarted that with the India International Center.
Oh, wow, that's great.
And we have the advocate Shobha Gupta to talk about Bilkis Bano this month. So it's good that we can continue to hold events of this kind. And I think what keeps Vidhi also alive and kicking is our cafeteria manager Kailash ji.
I was coming
who makes the most amazing sandwiches, which Raghu has also had.
Very fond of.
And
I'm supposed to meet him again.
you should meet him, because I think he really likes people who come back to him and praise the sandwiches. But to be on a serious note, I think that's the kind of homely feeling that makes it both a professional work environment as well as a nurturing familial environment.
Well said, sir. Well said. With this, we come to the final question, sir. For all those aspiring policy, law, or even non-law policy graduates who are wanting to make a career in the area of public policy, sir, what are your 2 cents?
First is that the underlying basis for public policy is wanting to do public service. I think this is the key thing, that public policy is not a career, public policy is a service. Okay? This is something that we want to do good for others. And we shouldn't think of public policy as a way of doing politics without getting your hands dirty. Politics is the ultimate way of doing public policy. Okay? So if you are interested in public policy, then you have to be essentially interested in public life. So it is both on a technical side, policy in particular areas, but at a more general level, it is about doing good for citizens of India. So I think that's the first thing. The orientation shouldn't be that this is just another career. The orientation is that this is for the general public good. The second is, don't specialize too early. It's good to be a generalist right at the outset, because public policy essentially requires you right at the outset to be the jack of all trades or the Jill of all trades, as the case may be, because the fact is that public policy is a skill. It's a way of addressing a problem, of being able to look at a problem, look at the macro elements of what the big picture is, and also about the micro details in terms of how you're going to deliver on that particular problem. So essentially, don't specialize too early. If you're a student aspiring to be a public policy professional, don't specialize in one field, like I'm a corporate lawyer or I'm only going to work on financial regulation. Don't do that too early. You'll be able to do that at some point of time. And third is, there are very good universities both in India and abroad which have public policy degrees. They give you a great skill set, which as a law student I didn't have, and I wish at that time there were actually not that many public policy degrees, certainly in India, but give you essential qualitative and quantitative skills, particularly around data, and it will be useful for everybody to pick up those skills. There are Coursera courses, of course, as if you want to dip your feet into it, and of course there are public policy masters courses that exist, and I would strongly encourage anyone who's interested in a career in public policy to go out and and get some of these degrees so that they have the skills that it takes to be a good public policy professional. But ultimately, at the end of the day, what it essentially means is an orientation to public service to make India the best version of itself it can be, and to ensure that we live in a world where countries are not at war with each other as they are unfortunately today.
Right, so with that, we come to the end of our podcast. Do follow Vidhi's pages on social media, and if you are in Delhi or Bangalore, make it a point to attend their events. They're super interactive, super engaging. You do have a lot of fun. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Right, sir.